All right. You're welcome again to our series. I believe you are going to have a very stimulating time, just as I promised the other time. Today, we are going to look at a particular theory that most times is overlooked as a theory in literary studies and in the whole context of theorizing in literature. And that theory, well, some people will tell you that's a non-theory, and you find out why because of the assumptions of that theory. That theory is named Liberal Humanism. Humanism itself is a production of a history right back as far as the times of the Enlightenment in Europe, or let's put it broadly in the West, and then how it produced itself through the moment of the Renaissance period, the Renaissance ways of reconceptualizing human existence and progress in society. Before the Renaissance period in Europe, we had a particular time frame in history. Well, you may say pejoratively, that is, in a way that looks down on it, pejoratively called the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages are seen in European thought, Western thought, and history as a time of knowledge occlusion, a time when knowledge was boxed in, that man, the human self, was not really allowed to opine from an independent faculty of reasoning. Okay? He or she was, so to speak, boxed in into a theocentric epistemology of worldview. By theocentric, I mean a kind of worldview that had God as the primary lens of looking at the world. So during the time of the Middle Ages, we had a particular doctrine that was in vogue. Actually, the theocentric, the God-like kind of thing that was in operation in society as a form of knowledge production was in favor of the Roman Catholic epistemology that was so much, so to speak, intertwined with governance in Europe. You had, in most cases, the monarchs in Europe, and then you had the Catholic Church. The Pope had so much influence in society. And within that period, just after the classical period, which was very robust in culture, you're talking about the Greek culture, series of cultures, if you like, and forms of enlightenment that were seen as classical, that produced a number of philosophies and philosophers. Philosophies that had to do with looking at art and humanity in a new way that allowed the self to rationalize, to conceptualize things, to imagine things in very, very secular and also religious fashions that produced man as a kind of fantastic creator of knowledges. That was the time when you had philosophers like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. You had people that were actually positioning the world, the future, so to speak, in a context where the mind could operate. But just after the fall of that period, we had a situation in which the Roman Empire, together with the Pope, had a way in which almost every culture and every form of reasoning within Europe fell into the epistemology called the Great Chain of Being. That Great Chain of Being had a kind of organogram, so to speak, in which the Great Being was seen at the top of power, followed by, a series of vassal powers, like you had the king, you had the monarch, you had officials of state, and it trickled down that way. So in the Great Chain of Being, humanity and human cultures were seen as fused together, There was a hierarchy by which almost everything was conceived from a theocentric Catholic Christian perspective. That was the age when you had the moral plays, you had the miracle plays, and these plays definitely had Manichaean thematics. When we talk about something being Manichaean, we are talking about a structure, a system in which you had a binary opposition of good and bad, of right and left, of white and black, and so many other things like that. So there was a parallel of opposite knowledges, in which one was definitely superior to the other one which it negated. So by that kind of situation, the kind of literature and the kind of theoretical underpinnings that informed literature were guarded by theocentric terms of morals, of codes of conduct, of ethics, of relationships, in which the divine dictated to the unconscious and the subconscious of the human being. So the reason why philosophers would call such an age as an age of darkness was because they felt that the human mind was not allowed to gestate, to fecundate, that is, to bring about a kind of fertility of the potentials it could give to human progress. But with time, just like all forms of histories and all forms of things that come with history, tend to change. That time was superseded by the Renaissance period, roughly starting from the 14th century and progressing to about the 15th to 16th century. So within the Renaissance period, there was a particular fixation, a particular concentration on the power of the mind of man, the potential that was put within the doctrine called humanism. By humanism, we mean a kind of knowledge production and a kind of practice, in fact, a kind of way of seeing the world, by which there was much emphasis on the ingrained productivity, the integral productivity of the human mind. So that was the age that celebrated the freedom of mind, the freedom of rationality, the freedom of creativity, away from theocentric expectations of morals and of the worship of the great being, and so on and so forth. Definitely, just as this kind of thing, that is knowledge production in the Middle Ages, affected literature, the turn of humanism within the Enlightenment period, also definitely informed literature and literary activities in Europe. Some of the main writers of that time included the canonical, very historic figure called William Shakespeare. It was also the time of people of Sir Philip Sidney, and it was a period that saw a kind of possibility of the human mind in so many ways. For example, in the arts, you had such fantastic figurations of graphic arts in Europe, that up till today still become canonized, that is, seen as standard references to arts. It was the time that we had a whole lot of scientific inventions, a whole lot of imaginations that brought humanity away from the shell of what you can call a theocentric imprisonment. And then humanity within the European world began to experiment in so many things. Themes that were seen as abominable in those days. Themes that looked at states that contradicted the excesses of power, that looked at the intricacies of human relationships and the intrigues, of such relationships as it had to do with gender, class, privilege, reasoning, and so many other things like that. So within that kind of context, humanism affected philosophy, it affected music, it touched on the arts, it touched on architecture, it even touched on religion, because you began to have, for example, when you talk about people from the Christian religious perspective, began to antagonize some things they felt that were perhaps too high-handed within Roman Catholicism. You had a figure like Martin Luther, who read the Bible, and from the kind of consciousness of humanism, that is the liberality of the mind, to suggest, to conceptualize, to propose, and then also to direct that proposition into positive things, you had, even within religion, a figure like Martin Luther presenting some theses that were based on his private reading of the Bible that questioned the high-grounded, unscriptural observations, according to his own thesis, of the Roman Catholic Church. And that was the birth of the Protestant Church. So even what you call humanism became the spirit, the knowledge spirit that was guiding the direction of humanity within Europe and by extension within Western thoughts right from the moment of the Renaissance period. Now back to our lecture on liberal humanism. Of course, we might even say to talk about liberal and humanism joined together will be a kind of tautology, that is a kind of repetition of concepts, a kind of repetition of idea. Because when you talk about the liberal, you are by extension, in the context of the humanism happening in Europe, you are talking about also the reign of the human agency to direct the cosmic affair in which the human being was in direct scientific, philosophical control of. So, by liberal humanism attached to literature, there was this conception that the human was very, very germane in anything that had to do with literature, and that there was no relevance of literature if it did not, in the first instance, ennoble human character, the human spirit, and make humanity very, very self-concealed in such a way that it could reproduce itself in very positive ways that society could grow and become better. So when you talk about the concept of liberal humanism, we are talking about certain positions that were made about literature. Number one, literature was seen as an aesthetic site in which man, that is, man as man and woman, I'm talking about man in a generic form, not in a way that several other critics might be accused of, as maybe privileging maleness and ignoring femaleness. No, I'm not talking about that here. I'm just using man as a generic term. That within the concept of the textual, in the gaze of liberal humanism as a theory of literature, humanity was seen as very, very unique, and all that will ennoble man or the human being was seen as the essence of literature. By extension, liberal humanism saw literature also as a self-contained, self-defined, self-accomplished production, artifact, work of art that universally represented the story of viable human experience. By extension, the liberal humanist theory of literature saw literature as a text that is not conditioned by cultural indices. It's not a product of culture or history or the intention of an author or the expectations of a particular kind of aesthetics that must be there. The liberal humanist was saying that literature was self-contained, and anywhere you read the work of art or you came across literature, it produced a kind of effect, a kind of literary and consumer effect for the audience that could be felt anywhere in the world. That is, if I was reading William Shakespeare's Macbeth, or I was reading Othello, or reading The Tempest in Nigeria, that the same pleasure, the same accomplishment, the same effect of literary enjoyment is what to be felt anywhere else in the world by anybody, whether the person is African or European or Arab or Asian, whatever the case may be. The same literary effect, the rhetorical force and enjoyment or gain that I get in literature is the same thing that will be produced in any human being that encounters that kind of literature. Number two is that literature is an aesthetic product that transcends time. It is the same in any historical sphere, any temporal sphere of human experience. That is, as it was in William Shakespeare's days, so is it in the times of Nigerian days of blacks reading the same Tempest. In other words, if I were a man or you are a woman, I happen to be a boy, you are a girl, I happen to be white, you are black, I happen to come from a culture from Africa and you are coming from a culture in China or in Canada or the United States, we are both going to have the same kind of effect, the same kind of reading, the same kind of judgment of that literature. In fact, another thing about liberal humanism in relation to literature was that there was no way in which you could subject literature to criticism, because literature has nothing to be criticized. The thing to bring into literature, like bringing some kind of philosophical opinion coming from what you might call racial theory or feminism, sexual orientation of a particular critical reading, or you are coming from a particular discipline like philosophy, or coming from a religious base and all that, all these things won't matter when encountering literature. That literature is self-contained, and anything that can break that unification of the literary text as a kind of exemplar of universalist audience consumption will be very, very extraneous. That is, will be very, very irrelevant to literature. One other thing you will find about liberal humanism is that it synthesizes, it fuses form and content in such a way that it doesn't allow a kind of judgment of its form and what thematics is bringing out. All those things are extraneous in liberal humanism, okay, as it has to do with literary theory. Another thing about this is that it sees literature as not an innovative practice. It sees it as a kind of embodiment of metaphysical textuality. That is, it is self-evident. Anywhere it goes, it is self-evident. In fact, some theorists have tried to itemize some tenets of liberal humanism as being within certain yardstick of 10 commandments. And all these things I've said are contained within the 10 tenets assumed to be of liberal humanism. Liberal humanism therefore becomes the kind of theory that proposes literature as universalist, as transspatial, it is transhistoric, it has no bias about discursivity, that is an angle it is bringing its presentation or information from, maybe in a kind of political way. No, it just sees literature as a kind of consumption that anybody can assume. And then what makes it liberal or humanist in that context is that it is human being centered, and it is supposed to enable the best of the potential of man. It projects literature as a kind of literary proposition that does not have to be looked at as being predetermined by the author. The author in liberal humanism, just like you'll find out in some other subsequent theories, the author is not a matter to really consider in interpreting literature. The author might just be a kind of, tool that produces the literature. Liberal humanism focuses on the text. In other words, the author is not the issue. Different ways by which different audiences see the literature as different information doesn't come up here. The text is seen as self-subliming, self-contained, self-accomplished, and therefore universally approachable and consumed by different audiences, wherever they come from, of different timescapes. So literature becomes a kind of silent and very unassuming artifact rather than a programmatic propagandist production. It is a very, very unassuming, so to speak, but very, very strong and self-revealing production that cannot be contained or that cannot be faced by other forms of looking at it, maybe from gendered or racial or colonial or post-colonial or whatever you might be looking at that might be seen as political agenda of looking at literature. A number of things go in here. For the text in liberal humanism, the text is sovereign, and the information, the communication the text is given is very, very unhidden. It is naked. It is not masked. By extension, there are no private meanings as to how to interpret a text that is literary. It is, so to speak, already written, already read the moment you encounter literature. Now, I want to talk about a particular theory. So many factors brought in this view of literature, okay, in literary conception of history. But then we know that by talking about liberal humanism, although there have been people that had been bringing this kind of things and ages that have been projecting this kind of vision of literature right from ancient times. For instance, if we remember what we said about the production of literature during the classical Greek times, especially the pre-Platonic moments, you will find out that to a very great extent, even though they didn't theorize it that way, literature had a way of being seen as literature because it produced a kind of aesthetics that was knowable and which everybody enjoyed as literature. We were talking about Homer the other time, the last lecture, that he proposed that if you are going to be a poet, to be very, very, so to speak, attuned to the highest level of linguistic experimentations and production, the assumption that Homer was having there was that in its own right, any form of what was seen as good literature transcended time, transcended private biases of people from a political perspective. It just presented itself as literature. It's like saying that you'll always know an elephant when you see one. You can't mistake it as an ant, for example. You'll always know a lion when it comes to you. Hopefully it won't get to you. You just see it at the zoo. But then you'll always know them. By extension, you'll always know literature as it is. The arrowhead originator of this theory in a conservative academic landscape of reading the history of liberal humanism as it has come to us in contemporary times was a man called F.D. Maurice. Frederick Denison Maurice was born in 1805 and died in 1872. Maurice was a product of several realities that made him a scholar that often disappointed conventions. He came from a Christian family where his father was a clergy. He belonged to a Unitarian faith observation of Christianity. When you talk about the Unitarian, you are saying that the Godhead was seen as one. The idea of the Trinity didn't exist. In other words, Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit weren't seen as co-partners with the Father that we know about it in Christianity. Rather, the Father seemed to be in the Unitarian conception of Christianity as the main reference in the Godhead, and Jesus just happens to be a kind of subordinate to him, something like that. F.D. Maurice's father happened to be a scholar in his own right. He was a fantastic thinker. And because of his depth of knowledge, he felt that this kind of thing must be reproduced in his son in what he saw as proper education. So Maurice, actually, that is the F.D. Maurice we are talking about, was well schooled. He went to school, he went to the seminary, and at the end of the day, he graduated as a lawyer from a very ivory tower university in the United Kingdom. But unknown to the father, his Christian upbringing and his association began to make him to look at a number of things within his secular society as not acceptable. Number one, he was somebody that had so much sympathy to the masses. And by extension, he was somebody that felt that there was a need to upgrade the lifestyle, the life realities of the masses. And by extension, he was in absolute interrogation against the elite class, the aristocracy, which in his time was seen in his own kind of radical scholarship as global elites. In other words, they were cut off away from the reality of the environment. So Maurice felt that literature had something to play to raise the humanity of everybody within society. And he subscribed to the middle class as a bridge between the excesses of the elite and the downtroddenness of the masses. And he elected for a middle class education as an identity of Englishness. And he also felt that the middle class represented the ideal of what it means to be English in society. And along that line, he extended his belief system within literature into a number of social work that had to do with bringing in the poor people into Bible study, into getting to know things, and he philosophized a number of things that were calculated to improve the humanity of the masses. Along that line, literature for Maurice was something that was supposed to be ennobling, something to make humanity a better thing. Maurice happens to be a very interesting character to follow up as we talk about the influence he had on liberal humanism. We're going to exhaust that in the next lecture. Just remember to subscribe, like, share this video, but let's wait for the very next lecture, which will be exhausting Maurice and the intricacies of liberal humanism, its strengths, its weaknesses, and, its dynamics in so many ways.